The air in the Rayburn House office building usually smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and the distinct, metallic scent of ambition. But today, inside the hearing room, the air tasted like ozone, the sharp, electric precursor to a lightning strike. Congressman Thomas Massie sat alone in his thoughts, an island of calm amidst the frantic rustling of aides and the low murmur of the press gallery. He didn't look like the others. He didn't have the plastic sheen of the career politicians sitting to his left, the ones who had spent the morning preening for the cameras, rehearsing sound bites designed to trend on Twitter but change absolutely nothing. Massie was different. He was an engineer in a room full of actors. He didn't care about the theater. He cared about the structural integrity of the lies they were being fed. And today, he had brought a sledgehammer. He looked down at the mahogany table in front of him. For documents, just 4 sheets of paper, innocuous to the naked eye, arranged with the geometric precision of a man who built his own house off the grid. To anyone else, they were just printouts. To Massie, they were the 4 corners of a cage he was about to drop on the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Across the room, Kash Patel sat at the witness table. Patel was a fighter. Massie knew that. A man who had been in the trenches against the Russia hoax. A man who had seen the swamp creatures up close and lived to tell the tale. But today, Patel wasn't just Kash. Today, he was the face of the Bureau. He was the proxy for an institution that had lost its way, an institution that had turned its blind eye into an art form. Massie respected Patel, but respect wouldn't save him from the questions that had to be asked. This wasn't personal. It was necessary. It was a purging. The room quieted down as the gavel banged, a hollow wooden sound that echoed off the high ceilings. The cameras zoomed in, their red tally lights blinking like unblinking eyes. The Democrats on the dais shifted in their seats. They sensed it too. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over Washington, D.C. when the script is about to be broken. Usually, these hearings were choreographed dances. The Republicans would shout about budget cuts. The Democrats would shout about democracy. Everyone would go to lunch. But Massie wasn't looking at the script. He was looking at the truth. Gentleman is recognized. The chairman's voice droned, tired and dismissive. Massie didn't jump. He didn't lean into the microphone with theatrical aggression. He simply adjusted his glasses, a movement so mundane it felt dangerous. He picked up the first document. His hands were steady. So, I've got 4 documents I'd like to introduce into the record, Massie began. His voice was deceptive, a Kentucky drawl that sounded polite, almost neighborly. It was the voice of a man offering you iced tea on a porch, right before he tells you your house is built on a sinkhole. He held up the first paper. The ink on the page seemed to burn. The first one is Jeffrey Epstein's 6 story played out for years in plain sight. Massie let the title hang there for a second. He watched the room. At the mention of the name, Epstein, a ripple went through the Democratic side of the aisle. It was subtle, a shifting of weight, a clearing of throats, eyes darting down to briefing papers. The ghost of the pedophile financier was the one guest no one wanted in this room. Yet he was the only one who truly mattered. Massie continued, his eyes locking onto Patel, then panning to the cameras. And Acosta is quoted in here, saying, "I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone." Boom. The sentence landed with the weight of a physical blow. Alexander Acosta, the former labor secretary, the man who had cut the sweetheart deal of the century. Massie wasn't just quoting a news article. He was invoking the darkest whisper in American politics. Epstein belonged to intelligence. It was the open secret that the swamp had spent years trying to bury under layers of redactions and suicide theories. Massie watched the faces of the press corps. The younger reporters looked confused, scribbling furiously. The older ones, the lifers who had seen administrations come and go, looked up, their expressions hardening. They knew. They all knew. But hearing it read into the congressional record, stripped of euphemism, was an act of war against the narrative. For decades, the media had painted Epstein as a singular monster, a wealthy pervert operating in a vacuum. Massie was tearing that portrait down. He was painting the real picture, Epstein as an asset, Epstein as a tool. Epstein as a protected species in the ecosystem of federal intelligence. He didn't stop to let them recover. He moved to the second document. The rhythm of his speech was deliberate, methodical. The second document is entitled, What Epstein's Bodyguard Warned About His CIA Connections. The acronym cut through the noise of the HVAC system like a razor. CIA. In the back of the room, a staffer for a prominent Democrat congressman whispered something urgently into his boss's ear. The congressman's face tightened. This was going off the rails. They were supposed to be talking about budgets or oversight or bureaucratic inefficiencies. They weren't supposed to be talking about Langley. They weren't supposed to be talking about the company. Massie felt a cold anger simmering in his gut. He thought about the millions of Americans who had been gaslit for years. They were told to trust the plan, to trust the institutions. Meanwhile, the institutions were running off-book operations with monsters. He wasn't doing this for the cameras. He was doing it for the people in Kentucky who asked him at every town hall, "Why doesn't anyone go to jail?" He held up the third document. The third document is from Fox Digital. It's titled Epstein's Private Calendar Reveals Planned Meetings with Obama Admin Official, CIA Chief. He emphasized the names. Obama Administration. CIA Chief. This was the pivot. This was where Massie stripped away the partisan shield the Democrats try to hide behind. They loved to pretend that corruption was a Republican invention, a product of the bad orange man. But Massie was laying the receipts on the table. This route went deep. It went back to the golden child of the Democratic Party. It went to the very head of the Central Intelligence Agency. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. The air felt thin, insufficient for the number of lungs trying to breathe. Patel remained stoic, his face a mask of professional discipline. He knew what Massie was doing. He knew the game. As a former prosecutor and defense official, Patel understood that Massie was building a cage, bar by bar. And Patel, sitting in the witness chair, was the one who would have to answer for the keys. Massie didn't smile. There was no joy in this. Only the grim satisfaction of a mechanic finding the cut-break line. He moved to the final document, the coup de grace. And the last document is a Wall Street Journal article that highlights Ehud Barak's 36 meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. He paused, looking over the rim of his glasses. He wanted to make sure they heard the name. Ehud Barak. He was the former Prime Minister of Israel and head of military intelligence for Israel. Mossad. He didn't say the word, but it echoed in the silence between his sentences. The implications were staggering. CIA, Mossad. The Obama administration. This wasn't a sex trafficking ring. This was an international intelligence operation fueled by blackmail and human misery. And Thomas Massie, a fiercely independent libertarian from Kentucky, was reading the indictment live on C-SPAN. Without objection, the chairman mumbled, the words sounding like they were filled with gravel. He wanted to object. Every fiber of the establishment wanted to object. They wanted to cut the feed, bang the gavel, call a recess, bury these papers in the basement of the National Archives. But they couldn't. Not now. Not with the cameras rolling. Not when the questions were this simple. It may have held that title when he met Epstein, Massie added, clarifying the timeline with engineer-like precision, ensuring no loophole was left open for a fact check later. And then, yes, without objection, the chair continued, stumbling slightly. Then, the interruption came, predictable as the sunrise. The gentleman will hold for a second. A voice cut in. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Jamie Raskin. Or maybe it was one of the interchangeable defenders of the state. It didn't matter which one. They all sounded the same when they were panicked. They sounded like gears grinding in a machine that had run out of oil. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Democrat voice was smooth, oily, trying to reassert control, try to lower the temperature that Massie had just cranked up to boiling. Just one UC request. This is Judge Angel Ray's decision from August in U.S. versus Epstein, stating the government's 100,000 pages of Epstein files dwarfs the 70-odd pages of Epstein grand jury materials. Massie sat motionless. He listened to the interruption with the patience of a predator watching prey struggle in a net. He understood exactly what the Democrat was doing. It was a classic muddy-the-waters tactic. Throw out big numbers, 100,000 pages, to make it seem like the government was drowning in transparency. Look at all the paper we have. Look how hard we're working. It was designed to make Massie's 4 sheets of paper look insignificant. It was designed to bore the audience, to lull them back into the comfortable sleep of bureaucracy. See, the government has handled it. The judge said so, but Massie knew better. He knew that 100,000 pages of redacted nothingness was worth less than 1 page of truth. He knew that files didn't mean answers. They were trying to suffocate the truth with volume. They were trying to bury the bodies under a mountain of paperwork. The Democrat finished his little speech, looking pleased with himself. He had followed the playbook. He had defended the shield. Without objection, the chair said, eager to move past the awkwardness. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Massie looked at the clock. The red numbers counted down. 5 minutes to unravel a decade of cover-ups. 5 minutes to force the FBI to admit what everyone suspected. 5 minutes to expose the fact that the justice system had become a protection racket for the powerful. He didn't need 5 minutes. He turned his full attention to Kash Patel. The prelude was over. The documents were in the record. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. Massie leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His body language shifted from passive observer to active interrogator. He wasn't reading anymore. He was engaging. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Massie said, brushing aside the interruption as if it were a fly. He locked eyes with Patel. Director Patel, I watched some of your Senate hearing yesterday." Massie's mind raced back to the footage he had studied the night before. He had watched Senator Kennedy, another sharp mind, disguised as a folksy Southern lawyer, grill Patel. Kennedy had asked the obvious question, who else? Who else did Epstein traffic these girls to? And Patel's answer? Massie remembered it vividly. It was the answer that had kept Massie awake. There is no credible information that he trafficked them to anyone else. No credible information. That phrase was the shield. It was the FBI's favorite catchphrase. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a keep out sign. It didn't mean the information didn't exist. It meant the FBI had decided it wasn't credible. It meant they had decided not to believe the victims. It meant they had looked at the evidence and chosen to look away. Massie felt the indignation rising in his chest, but he channeled it into cold, hard logic. He wasn't here to scream. He was here to dismantle that phrase. He was here to prove that no credible information was a lie. He took a breath. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. The staffers behind him stopped typing. The press gallery leaned forward. Even the police officers standing by the doors seemed to tense up. Massie was about to cross the Rubicon. He was about to take the conversation from conspiracy theory to federal record. He was about to ask why the FBI, the premier law enforcement agency in the world, the agency with a multi-billion-dollar budget and surveillance capabilities that could read a license plate from space, couldn't find a single other person involved in the most prolific sex trafficking ring in history. He was about to ask, are you incompetent or are you complicit? But he would start slower. He would start with the jurisdiction. He would start with the geography of a lie. When Senator Kennedy asked you, you replied, according to the transcript, there is no credible information that he trafficked them to anyone else. Massie let the absurdity of that statement sink in. Epstein, the man who flew presidents and princes on his private jet. Epstein, the man who had a safe full of videotapes. Epstein, the man who belonged to intelligence. And the official position of the United States government was that he was a lone wolf, that he collected these powerful friends for their conversation, that he ran a global trafficking network just for himself. It was an insult to the intelligence of every American citizen. Massie saw a flicker in Patel's eyes, a moment of recognition. Patel knew that answer was weak. He knew it was the company line, dictated by the constraints of closed cases and sealed deals. But Patel was bound by his role. He had to defend the record. Massie, however, was bound by nothing but his oath to the Constitution and his disdain for the swamp. You also said somewhere in the hearing and here today that the problem is that the case files are constrained by limited search warrants from 2006 to 2007 and that the non-prosecution agreement hamstrung future investigations. This was the excuse. The Florida excuse. Oh, we couldn't do anything because those local prosecutors in Florida messed it up back in 2006. It was the perfect scapegoat. Blame the past. Blame the locals. Blame the deal that everyone agreed was corrupt, but no one wanted to overturn. Massie was about to destroy that excuse. He had done his homework. He knew something that the FBI hoped most congressmen didn't know. He knew geography, and he knew that the Southern District of New York was not the Southern District of Florida. The trap was fully deployed. Massie had the documents on the table. He had the quote on the record. He had the witness in the chair. And he had the absolute, unwavering conviction that he was the only man in the room willing to say the quiet part out loud. He prepared to deliver the strike. The silence in the room was deafening, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the sound of a reputation shattering. Massie thought, "You want to hide behind jurisdiction, Kash? Fine. Let's talk about New York." The room was still vibrating from Massie's opening salvo, but he didn't give the frequency time to settle. He had Patel in the crosshairs, and he could see the defensive posture taking shape on the other side of the table. Patel was leaning on the Florida excuse. It was the standard issue shield for anyone in the DOJ when the name Epstein came up. "We were handcuffed," they would say. "The 2006 non-prosecution agreement tied our hands." It was a convenient narrative because it shifted the blame backward in time to a different administration, to a different decade. It made the current inaction seem like a tragic inevitability rather than a deliberate choice. But Thomas Massie wasn't buying it. He knew that the Florida excuse was a legal fiction designed to comfort the masses, a bedtime story told to keep the public from looking under the bed where the real monsters were hiding. Those constraints only apply to Southern District of Florida, Massie said. His voice dropped an octave, losing the questioning lilt and taking on the hard edge of a statement of fact. He wasn't asking, he was instructing. They do not apply to Southern District of New York. The distinction was sharp, like the crack of a whip. Massie saw the subtle flinch in Patel's jaw muscle. It was the tell. Patel knew exactly where Massie was going. The Southern District of New York, the SDNY, often called the Sovereign District of New York, was known for its independence, its aggression, and its reach. They didn't care about a sweetheart deal cut by a local prosecutor in Miami nearly 20 years ago. When they indicted Epstein in 2019, they blew the doors off the double jeopardy argument. Massie leaned forward, his eyes boring into Patel. He was stripping away the bureaucracy's armor, piece by piece. The location of the 2019 sex trafficking indictment, which produced many things including a series of FD 302 documents. FD 302. To the average viewer watching on C-SPAN, it was just a jumble of letters and numbers. But in that room, it was a magic word. An FD 302 is the holy grail of FBI record-keeping. It is the formal report filed by an agent after an interview. It isn't hearsay. It isn't a rumor found on an internet forum. It is the official government-stamped record of what a witness told a federal agent. By invoking the 302s, Massie was changing the nature of the battlefield. He wasn't talking about theories anymore. He was talking about evidence that was currently sitting in FBI servers, gathering digital dust. According to victims who cooperated with the FBI in that investigation, Massie continued, his voice steady, relentless. "These documents in FBI possession, your possession, detail at least 20 men." He paused. He let the number hang in the air. 20 men. Not just Epstein. Not just Ghislaine Maxwell. 20 other men. Massie could feel the unease rippling through the room. The aides behind the Democratic members were frozen, their thumbs hovering over their phones, unsure if they should text their bosses or check their own contacts. The sheer scale of the implication was terrifying. If there were 20 men detailed in official FBI interview forms, men who had utilized Epstein's services and not one of them had been indicted, what did that say about the Department of Justice? It said the system was rigged. It said that if you were rich enough, powerful enough, and connected enough to the intelligence apparatus Massie had mentioned earlier, you were untouchable. Massie pressed on, refusing to let the moment dissipate. He needed to make this concrete. He needed a name, including Mr. Jess Staley, CEO of Barclays Bank, who Jeffrey Epstein trafficked victims to. He dropped the name like a heavy stone into a still pond. Jess Staley, a titan of finance, a man who ran one of the biggest banks in the world. Massie wasn't picking low-hanging fruit. He was aiming at the top of the food tree. Victims including minors such as Virginia Roberts Giuffre, Massie added, his voice softening slightly out of respect for the name, before hardening again. May she rest in peace. He corrected himself internally. Giuffre was alive, a warrior fighting for truth, but the sentiment of resting applied to the justice she had been denied. The system wanted her silence. The system wanted her to be a memory, not a litigant. Correction, Massie likely misspoke or was referring to the many victims who have passed or been silenced. But in the heat of the moment, the error only highlighted the tragic toll of the case. Or perhaps he was conflating victims. Regardless, the point stood: real women, real abuse, real monsters. That list also includes at least 19 other individuals. Massie watched Patel. The director was in a bind. Patel was a patriot. Massie believed that. But right now, Patel was wearing the jersey of the FBI. He was the goalkeeper for a team that had been throwing the game for decades. Patel had to defend the process. He had to defend the integrity of the investigation. But Massie was tearing the process apart to show the rot underneath. One Hollywood producer worth a few $100 million, Massie listed, ticking them off on his fingers. One royal prince. One high-profile individual in the music industry. The rhythm was hypnotic. It was a litany of the untouchables. One very prominent banker. One high-profile government official. One high-profile former politician. With every category, Massie was widening the net. He was showing the American people that this wasn't just about a pervert on an island. This was about the ruling class. This was about the Uniparty. This was about the people who went to Davos, the people who wrote the laws, the people who funded the campaigns. One owner of a car company in Italy. One rock star. One magician. The absurdity of the list only made it more horrifying. It sounded like the guest list for a Vanity Fair party from hell. A magician? A rock star? It showed the indiscriminate nature of Epstein's operation. He was collecting blackmail on everyone. He was building a spiderweb that caught flies from every sector of influence: culture, finance, politics, royalty. At least 6 billionaires, including a billionaire from Canada. Massie stopped. He lowered his hand. He looked around the room. The silence was absolute. Even the rustling of papers had stopped. The air conditioning hummed, a low, indifferent drone that underscored the gravity of the moment. "We know these people exist in the FBI files," Massie said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "The files that you control." He pointed a finger at Patel. It wasn't an accusation of personal guilt. It was an assignment of responsibility. "I don't know exactly who they are," Massie admitted, embracing his role as the outsider, the representative of the people who are always kept in the dark. "But the FBI does. The FBI does." That was the crux of the strike. The knowledge existed. The truth wasn't lost. It was sequestered. It was locked away in a server room in the J. Edgar Hoover building, guarded by men in suits who believed that protecting the institution was more important than protecting children. "Have you launched any investigation indictment?" Massie asked, stumbling slightly over the words because his mind was moving faster than his mouth. He wanted to say investigation, but he meant indictment. He meant handcuffs. He meant perp walks. Patel shifted in his chair. The camera caught the movement, a slight adjustment of his tie, a repositioning of his shoulders. It was the body language of a man preparing to deflect a blow he knew he couldn't fully block. "So, is the loophole here?" Massie pressed, sensing the hesitation. "Or is it your assertion that these victims aren't credible? That the 302s maybe didn't produce credible statements that rise to a probable cause?" This was the trap within the strike. Massie was forcing Patel to choose. Either the FBI was incompetent, the loophole, or the FBI was calling the victims liars, not credible. There was no third option. There was no good answer. If Patel said the victims weren't credible, he would be spitting in the face of every woman who had come forward, Every survivor who had bravely sat down with an FBI agent and relived her trauma. If he said it was a loophole, he was admitting the system was broken. Patel took a breath. He looked tired. Not physically tired, but spiritually weary. He was a man who knew too much, forced to explain it to people who knew too little, in a format designed for sound bites rather than solutions. "It's not my assertion, sir," Patel began, his voice measured, practicing the calm detachment required of his office. Deflection. Massie noted it immediately. "Don't own the opinion. Attribute it to the process. It's the assertion of, at two different United States attorneys' offices from three separate administrations who investigated those same materials in lifetime. Three separate administrations. Bush, Obama, Trump." Patel was spreading the blame. He was saying, "Look, it's not just us. Everyone looked at this. Everyone passed on it. To a normal person, this might sound like a defense. If everyone looked at it and did nothing, maybe there was nothing there. But to Massie and to the millions of Americans who had lost faith in the system, this wasn't a defense. It was an indictment of the entire establishment. It confirmed that the cover-up was bipartisan. It confirmed that when it came to protecting the elite, red and blue worked together in perfect harmony. The Uniparty wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a standard operating procedure. "Are the 302 documents in the FBI's possession?" Massie interrupted. He didn't care about the three administrations. He didn't care about the history lesson. He wanted to know about the physical location of the truth. "They reviewed all that." "Yes, sir," Patel answered. And so have you reviewed those 302 documents where the victims name the people who victimized them?" Massie drove the question home. He was personalizing it again. "You, Kash. You, the man in the chair. Have you looked?" "If I personally know," Patel started, stumbling. "But the FBI has. The FBI has. The institution again. The faceless, nameless entity." "So, how can you sit here?" Massie said, his voice rising, the frustration finally boiling over, "and in front of the Senate and say there are no names?" "I said all. I named one today." Patel tried to interject. I said we are not in the practice at the Department of Justice, FBI, of releasing victims' names," Patel stammered. He was on the ropes. He was falling back on protocol. "We don't release names. We protect privacy." "That is not what we do," Patel insisted, finding his footing on the moral high ground of privacy protection. "We are also not in the habit of releasing incredible information. That's not what we do. Incredible information." There was again the catch-all phrase for inconvenient truth. Massie sat back for a split second, processing the exchange. Patel was good. He was very good. He had managed to turn a question about perpetrators into an answer about victims' privacy. It was a classic DOJ judo move. "We can't tell you who the bad guys are because we're so busy protecting the good guys." But Massie saw through it. It was a hollow shield. They weren't protecting the victims. They were using the victims as a shield to protect the predators. By refusing to name the 20 men under the guise of unverified information, they were ensuring those men remained free to prey again. The strike had landed, but the beast wasn't dead. It was just cornered. Massie glanced at the clock. Time was slipping away. He had exposed the existence of the files. He had forced the admission that the FBI had them. He had highlighted the absurdity of the no-names claim. But he wasn't done. He needed to make the hypocrisy visceral. He needed to show the world the difference between how the DOJ treated influencers and how it treated survivors. He prepared to pivot to the next phase of his attack. The room was no longer just a hearing. It was a crime scene, and Massie was the only one dusting for prints. The hearing room was no longer a place of governance. It had transformed into a theater of the absurd, a modern-day Roman Colosseum where the lions were facts and the gladiators were bureaucrats. Thomas Massie paused. He needed the silence. He needed the room to feel the weight of what he had just said. He had established the existence of the FD 302s. He had established that the FBI possessed them. Now he had to populate those files with ghosts. He looked down at the paper in front of him. It wasn't just a list. It was a roster of the American oligarchy. It was a who's who of the people who lectured the working class on morality while flying on private jets, to an island of horrors. That list also includes at least 19 other individuals, Massie said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. In a room built on acoustics designed to amplify the whispers of power, his voice carried the quiet devastation of a judge reading a death sentence. One Hollywood producer worth a few $100 million. Massie looked up, scanning the press gallery. The reporters, mostly liberal, mostly aligned with the cultural machinery of Los Angeles and New York, shifted uncomfortably. Hollywood, the great moral arbiter of the nation. The industry that spent years screaming, "Me too," while harboring monsters in its executive suites. Massie didn't name him. He didn't have to. The description was enough to send a chill through the spine of every studio executive watching the feed on their iPhone in Beverly Hills. "We know," Massie was saying. "The FBI knows. Your immunity is expiring." He went back to the paper. One royal prince. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen out of the room. A prince. The word evoked images of palaces, gold braid, and centuries of tradition. It was the ultimate symbol of the untouchable elite. A man born into power, shielded by sovereign immunity and the diplomatic protocols of the old world. But here, in this grimy hearing room in D.C., stripped of his titles and his guards, he was just another entry in an FBI file. Just another man who had allegedly used his power to exploit the powerless. Massie's mention of the prince was a direct challenge to the concept of nobility itself. In the Republic of the United States, there were supposed to be no kings. Yet, the FBI was protecting one high-profile individual in the music industry. The rhythm of the list was punishing. Bam, bam, bam. Massie was dismantling the cultural hierarchy piece by piece. First movies, then monarchy, now music. The idols of the youth. The people who filled stadiums and sold dreams. One very prominent banker. This hit closer to home. Washington, D.C. runs on the fumes of Wall Street. The bankers are the donors. They're the ones who host the fundraisers in the Hamptons. They're the ones who hire former congressmen as consultants for seven-figure salaries. To name a banker, even anonymously, was to threaten the money supply. It was to threaten the unspoken contract between Capitol Hill and Lower Manhattan. You fund us, we protect you. Massie was tearing that contract up. He saw the stiffening of the spines of his colleagues on the dais. Republicans and Democrats alike. They all took checks from these people. They all shook these hands. How many of them, Massie wondered, had shaken a hand that had been on Epstein's island? The thought was nauseating. One high-profile government official. One high-profile former politician. Massie let those words hang the longest. Government official. Former politician. He was talking about them. He was talking about the tribe. He was talking about the people who walked these halls, who sat in these chairs, who voted on these laws. The room felt claustrophobic. The deep state wasn't some abstract concept out there in the ether. It was potentially sitting in the room. It was potentially watching from the gallery. It was definitely watching from the televisions in the private offices of the fierce power brokers in D.C. Massie's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. This was the core of the MAGA movement's fury, distilled into a single moment. It was a realization that the people running the country were not just incompetent, they were compromised. They were vulnerable to blackmail. If a foreign intelligence agency, be it Mossad, as implied by the Barack document, or the CCP, or anyone else, had the same dirt that Epstein had, then American policy wasn't being decided in the interest of the voters. It was being decided in the interest of keeping secrets buried. One owner of a car company in Italy. The specificity was jarring. It showed the global reach of the network. It wasn't just an American problem. It was a globalist problem. It was the international jet set, the Davos crowd, the people who believed national borders were for the poor and laws were for the little people. One rock star, one magician. A nervous titter ran through the back of the room at magician, but it died instantly. There was nothing funny about it. It was grotesque. It painted a picture of Epstein's world as a perverse circus, where entertainers came to perform or partake, where the lines between amusement and abuse were blurred by wealth. At least 6 billionaires. Massie held up 6 fingers mentally. though his hands remained on the paper. 6, including a billionaire from Canada. He finished the list. He placed the paper down gently. The room was silent. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot. Massie looked at Kash Patel. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a gatekeeper. Patel was the man standing between the mob, the righteous, angry American mob, and the castle where the beasts lived. "We know these people exist in the FBI files," Massie said, his voice dropping to a register that was almost intimate, a conversation between two men amidst a crowd. "The files that you control." He was putting the burden solely on Patel's shoulders. He was saying, "You are carrying the weight of all these sins, Kash. Why? Why protect them?" "I don't know exactly who they are," Massie confessed, opening his hands. "But the FBI does. The FBI does." That sentence echoed. It was the ultimate indictment of the surveillance state. They knew everything. They knew who you called, what you bought, where you drove. And they knew who raped children on a private island. But they only used the power to prosecute grandmas walking through the Capitol on January 6th, not the billionaires flying to Little St. James. "Have you launched any indictment?" Massie corrected himself again, the Freudian slip revealing his true intent. He didn't want an investigation. Investigations were where truth went to die in Washington. He wanted indictments. He wanted justice. Patel shifted. He looked pained. He was a prosecutor by trade. He knew what probable cause looked like. He knew what a target letter looked like. And he knew that in a normal world, 20 names in a sex trafficking file would result in 20 raids at dawn. But this wasn't a normal world. This was the swamp. "So, is the loophole here?" Massie pressed, sensing Patel's discomfort. "Or is it your assertion that these victims aren't credible? That the 302s maybe didn't produce credible statements that rise to a probable cause?" Massie was boxing him in again. "Are the women liars, Kash? Is that the official position of the FBI?" "It's not my assertion, sir," Patel said, his voice tight. He was retreating into the safety of the bureaucracy. He was hiding behind the department. "It's the assertion of, at 2 different United States attorneys' offices from 3 separate administrations who investigated those same materials in lifetime." Patel was trying to dilute the responsibility. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone. It was the Bush people, the Obama people, the Trump people." But to Massie, this shared responsibility was exactly the problem. When everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. It was the uniparty defense. They all protected each other. The red team protected the blue team's predators, and the blue team protected the red team's predators because they all went to the same parties. They all belonged to the same club. "Are the 302 documents in the FBI's possession?" Massie demanded. He wasn't letting Patel drift into history. "He wanted to talk about now." "They reviewed all that." "Yes, sir," Patel said. And so have you reviewed those 302 documents that were the victims' name, the people who victimized them?" Massie's question was a laser. He was stripping away the we and asking about the I. "If I personally know, but the FBI has," Patel stammered. "So, how can you sit here and in front of the Senate and say there are no names?" Massie asked, his voice cracking with genuine disbelief. It was the question every person watching at home was screaming at their television. "How can you say there are no names when we just read a list of descriptions that obviously correspond to names?" "I said all. I named one today." Patel tried to pivot. I said we are not in the practice at the Department of Justice, FBI, of releasing victims' names," Patel said, finding his rhythm again. "That is not what we do. We are also not in the habit of releasing incredible information. That's not what we do." Incredible information. The term hung in the air like a foul smell. Incredible, in the legal sense, meant not credible. But to the layman, it sounded like amazing. And it was amazing. It was amazing that the FBI could dismiss the sworn testimony of victims as not credible when it implicated the powerful, yet would accept the flimsiest dossier paid for by a political campaign to spy on a presidential candidate. Massie stared at Patel. He saw the disconnect. He saw the 2 parallel realities. In Patel's reality, the reality of the DOJ, the FBI, the Beltway, truth was a legal construct defined by admissibility, statutes of limitation, and prosecutorial discretion. In Massie's reality, the reality of the patriot, the voter, the victim, truth was what happened. It was the raw, bloody, painful fact of abuse. But multiple authorities have looked at the entirety of what we have, Patel added, trying to close the door. Okay, I got to move on here, Massie said abruptly. He realized he wasn't going to get the names today. The wall was too high. The shield was too thick. But he had done something arguably more important. He had shown the world the outline of the door. He had shown them where the bodies were buried. He checked his notes. He had one more card to play in this round. One more way to highlight the hypocrisy of the institution. Were you present when the AG had the White House event when she released the binders to social media influencers? The question was a sharp left turn. It caught the room off guard. Social media influencers. The phrase sounded alien in a congressional hearing. But Massie knew exactly what he was doing. He was about to contrast the glitz of a PR stunt with the grime of the reality they were ignoring. He was about to show that the DOJ had plenty of time for TikTok, but no time for justice. The setup was complete. Massie had read the list. He had exposed the who. Now he was going to expose the why. He was going to expose the soul of an agency that cared more about likes and shares than it did about the broken lives of young girls. He took a breath, preparing to pivot to the moral climax of his interrogation. The phrase social media influencers hung in the air of the Rayburn building like the scent of cheap perfume in a sterile operating room. It was out of place. It was offensive. Thomas Massie let the absurdity of his own question settle over the room. He wasn't asking about a press conference with the New York Times or a briefing for the House Judiciary Committee. He was asking about a curated event for people whose primary qualification was their ability to generate clicks, dances, and viral trends. Were you present when the AG had the White House event when she released the binders to social media influencers? Massie's voice was dry, devoid of humor. This wasn't a joke. It was an autopsy of the Department of Justice's priorities. Kash Patel blinked. For the first time, the armor cracked, not with fear, but with a flicker of embarrassment. Even as a loyal soldier of the institution, even as a man who understood the necessity of public relations, he had to know how this looked. The Attorney General of the United States, the highest law enforcement officer in the land, handing over sensitive files, binders full of human tragedy, to a gaggle of TikTok stars and Instagram personalities. Yes, Patel replied. His answer was short. He wanted to move on. He didn't want to dwell on the image of the Department of Justice acting like a desperate marketing agency. But Massie wasn't moving on. He was digging in. So, if you're willing to meet with social media influencers who stood to benefit from the sensational and sad stories of these victims. Massie paused, letting the moral weight of that sentence crash down on the table. Who stood to benefit? That was the ugly truth of the modern media ecosystem. The influencers weren't there to solve the case. They were there for content. They were there to turn the suffering of trafficked children into engagement metrics. And the Department of Justice, under the Biden administration, had facilitated it. They had used the victims' pain as currency to buy popularity with Gen Z. It was a grotesque, symbiotic relationship. The state got to look transparent and hip, and the influencers got exclusive content to monetize. Meanwhile, the victims, the women who had been abused, trafficked, and silenced, remained in the shadows, uninvited, unheard. Will you meet with the victims as well? The question was a thunderclap. It stripped away all the bureaucratic jargon and left a naked moral choice. You made time for the clowns. Will you make time for the casualties? The room went deadly silent. The staffers behind Massie stopped shuffling papers. This was a question that exposed the heart of the deep state. They loved the people in the abstract, as voters, as data points, as an audience. But they despised the people in the concrete, as individuals with grievances, as victims demanding accountability. Patel shifted in his seat. He was trapped. He couldn't say no, because that would be political suicide. But he couldn't say yes, because that would break the protocol of distance that the FBI maintained to protect itself from liability. The FBI will meet with anyone who has no information, Patel said. It was a slip of the tongue. No information. He meant new information. But the Freudian slip was telling. The FBI treated everyone outside the agency as if they knew nothing, as if they were empty vessels waiting to be filled with the official narrative. Massie didn't let him off the hook. He saw the dodge. The FBI was a building. The FBI was an organization. Massie was talking to a man. Will you personally meet with him? Massie pointed a finger, not aggressively, but with pinpoint accuracy. He was piercing the corporate veil. He was demanding personal accountability from a leadership class that had forgotten the meaning of the word. Patel hesitated. That split-second hesitation spoke volumes. It was the pause of a man calculating the risk. Meeting with victims was dangerous. Victims cry. Victims scream. Victims ask questions that don't have prepared answers. Victims don't care about interagency constraints or jurisdictional limits. They only care about why. The FBI and the professionals who are handling the cases will, Patel answered, retreating once again behind the shield of the professionals. The professionals. Massie almost scoffed. The professionals were the ones who had lost the tapes. The professionals were the ones who had cut the sweetheart deal in Florida. The professionals were the ones who had let Epstein commit suicide in a maximum security federal facility while the cameras malfunctioned and the guards slept. Massie didn't trust the professionals. He trusted the victims. Were you instructed that it was important to release the documents to the Oversight Committee on the day of my introduction of the discharge petition to release these files? Massie shifted gears. He was attacking the timing now. The weaponization of the calendar. In Washington, there are no coincidences. Massie knew this. He had introduced a discharge petition, a parliamentary maneuver to force a vote, to force the files into the sunlight. It was a direct threat to the establishment's control over the timeline. And suddenly, miraculously, on that very same day, the DOJ had rushed to release documents. It was a classic news dump tactic. Flood the zone, distract, preempt the narrative, make Massie's petition look redundant. See, we're already releasing them. No need for a vote. I don't know what day that was. So no, Patel replied. It was the standard denial. I'm just a busy man. I don't follow the parliamentary schedule. Massie didn't buy it. These people tracked every heartbeat of the news cycle. But he let it slide because he had a bigger point to make about the consequences of that political game. Well, they were released that day, Massie said, his voice hardening with genuine anger. And there were victims' names who weren't redacted because they were in such a rush. This was the dagger. Massie was revealing the cost of the DOJ's PR strategy. In their haste to undercut Massie, in their rush to control the news cycle, the professionals had been sloppy. They had failed to redact the names of the victims. The irony was sickening. Minutes earlier, Patel had sat there and claimed he couldn't release the names of the perpetrators, the billionaires, the princes, the politicians, because the FBI was so concerned with privacy and integrity. He had claimed they couldn't release the names of the bad guys because it might be incredible information. But when it came to the victims, the innocent women whose lives had been shattered, the FBI had been careless. They had leaked their names to the world because they were in a rush to win a political news cycle. And the victims are not happy about that, Massie added. It was an understatement. It was a betrayal. It proved definitively where the system's loyalties lay. Protection for the predators. Exposure for the prey. Massie watched Patel. He watched the realization wash over the room. The Republican base, watching from home, would see this for what it was, the system protecting its own. The privacy argument was a lie. It was a selective shield deployed only when the names on the list were powerful. When the names were nobodies, girls from broken homes, aspiring models, massage therapists, their privacy was collateral damage in a PR war. Have you investigated any of the CIA connections? Massie pivoted again. The evasion phase was about showing the DOJ's refusal to look at the real power players. He was done talking about the DOJ's incompetence with victims. Now he wanted to talk about their cowardice with the intelligence community. He was going back to the beginning. The documents. The CIA. Have you seen the CIA file on Jeffrey Epstein? Massie asked. And if you want to see it, would they show it to you? This was the "who's your daddy?" question. Massie was asking the director of the FBI, the premier domestic law enforcement agency, if he was actually in charge. Or was he just a junior partner? Was the FBI subservient to the CIA? In the hierarchy of the deep state, everyone suspected the CIA sat at the top of the pyramid. The FBI were the cops. The CIA were the spooks. The cops had rules. The spooks had missions. Patel's answer was a masterpiece of bureaucratic submission. "Well, I can speak for the FBI," Patel started, cautious, testing the ground. "And that's presuming there's a CIA case file." Presuming. Massie shook his head internally. "Don't play dumb, Kash. Everyone knew there was a file. You don't have a man like Epstein meeting with Ehud Barak, meeting with CIA chiefs, meeting with Saudi princes, without Langley having a dossier thick enough to stop a bullet. And I've reviewed everything that the interagency, not I, the FBI, that was provided to us. That was provided to us. There it was. The confession of impotence. The FBI only saw what the interagency, code for CIA/NSA/ODNI, allowed them to see. They were fed scraps from the master's table. If the CIA decided a file was too hot to handle, if they decided it involved sources and methods, they simply didn't provide it. And the FBI, the so-called top cops, simply nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." Would you be willing to look at the CIA file on Jeffrey Epstein? Massie pressed. He was offering Patel a lifeline. He was offering him a chance to be a hero. Say yes. Say you'll demand it. Say you'll kick down the door at Langley if you have to. "If there is such a file," Patel said, retreating to the conditional tense, the safe harbor of a lawyer. "And if it has not already been turned over to the FBI will look at any new investigative leads." It was a non-answer. It was a no dressed up in a tuxedo. It meant, we will wait by the mailbox. If the CIA sends us something, we will read it. If they don't, we will assume it doesn't exist. Massie felt a profound sense of exhaustion. Not physical, but existential. He was talking to a wall. A polite, articulate, well-dressed wall, but a wall nonetheless. He had exposed the double standard with the victims. He had exposed the subservience to the CIA. He had exposed the influencer priority. He looked at his notes. He had 2 more questions, 2 more conspiracy theories that were rapidly becoming historical facts. He decided to throw them out there, not because he expected an answer, but because he needed them on the record. He needed to show that the Epstein case wasn't an isolated incident of FBI failure. It was part of a pattern of knowing and doing nothing, a pattern of having the evidence and losing it, a pattern of being the Federal Bureau of Inaction. Have you made any progress on the pipe bomb investigation January 6th? Massie asked. The pipe bomb, the ghost of J6, the device planted outside the DNC and RNC. The FBI had released video. They had the cell phone data. They had the geolocation. They had the most surveilled city on Earth. And yet, nothing. 3 years of silence. And have you made any progress on the motive of the Las Vegas shooter? The Las Vegas shooter. Stephen Paddock, the man who rained fire on a country music festival. The deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. And the FBI's conclusion? We don't know why he did it. A man spends months planning, buys an arsenal, sets up cameras, and leaves no motive? In the age of digital footprints? Massie linked them all together in one breath. Epstein, the pipe bomber, the Las Vegas shooter. 3 great mysteries. 3 massive crimes. 3 instances where the FBI, the agency that could find a grandmother in Alaska who posted a meme, suddenly became deaf, dumb, and blind. As to the first, it's an ongoing investigation and we have made progress, Patel recited the script. Ongoing investigation. The black hole where accountability goes to die. As to the second, sir, I'll have to get back to you. Massie closed his folder. He didn't slam it. He just closed it. All right. Thank you. I yield back. He yielded back his time, but he didn't yield the truth. He looked at the chairman. He looked at the cameras. The hearing was over. The theater was concluding. The Democrats would go out and say they held the FBI accountable. The Republicans would go out and clip their sound bites for Rumble and X. But Thomas Massie knew the reality. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was designed to protect the powerful, distract the public with influencers, and bury the truth under layers of interagency cooperation and jurisdictional constraints. As he stood up, Massie felt the weight of the room lift, replaced by the heavier burden of knowledge. He had walked into the trap, sprung it, and revealed the monster. But the monster was too big to kill with one hearing. The monster was the state itself. I yield back. The phrase signaled the end of the combat, but it didn't signal peace. Thomas Massie turned off his microphone. The little red light died, and with it, the artificial amplification of the truth. The room exhaled. It was a physical sensation, a collective release of breath from the staffers, the press, and the other members who had been holding their lungs tight, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. But the ceiling hadn't collapsed. The Rayburn building was still standing. The flag still hung limp in the corner. The Republic was still, nominally, intact. But something had changed. The silence that followed Massie's questions was louder than the noise of the gavel that dismissed the hearing. Massie sat there for a moment, watching Kash Patel gather his papers. Patel moved with the efficiency of a man who had survived a car crash and was just checking his limbs for broken bones. He stacked his binders. He capped his pen. He didn't look at Massie. There was a tragedy in that lack of eye contact. Massie respected Patel. In another life, in a different trench, they would be brothers in arms. They both despised the fake news. They both knew the Russia hoax was a coup. But today, the fault lines of Washington had forced them onto opposite sides of the canyon. Patel had chosen to defend the castle. Massie had chosen to lay siege to it. The hearing was over, but the echo of what wasn't said hung heavy in the air. What made this exchange matter, Massie thought as he watched the room disperse, wasn't the mention of intelligence agencies or famous names. It was the uncertainty. When he had asked Patel, the director of the FBI, if he had reviewed the files, the answer wasn't a clear yes or no. It was a kaleidoscope of bureaucratic qualifiers. The FBI has. Multiple authorities have. The interagency provided us. It was the language of a system designed to dissolve accountability. Massie stood up, smoothing his jacket. He felt the familiar weight of the Capitol on his shoulders. It was a heavy building built of marble and stone, but today it felt like it was built of fog. He walked out of the hearing room and into the long, echoey corridor. The press pack was waiting, a hungry hydra of microphones and cameras. Congressman, did you just accuse the CIA of hiding evidence? Congressman Massie, do you have proof the prince was involved? Is this a conspiracy theory, sir? Massie ignored them. He walked with a purpose, his stride long, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He didn't want to give them a soundbite. He wanted them to think. Think, he urged them silently. Don't just ask me for the headline. Look at the void. The void was the story. The story was that for 20 years, the most powerful surveillance apparatus in human history, a machine that could hear a whisper in a cave in Tora Bora, couldn't find a single accomplice for Jeffrey Epstein. The story was that the Department of Justice, which had the resources to track down every grandmother who waved a flag on January 6th, suddenly developed amnesia when the trail led to a private island. Massie turned a corner, leaving the shouting press behind. The hallway was quieter here. The marble busts of dead legislators stared down at him. They looked stern, principled. Massie wondered how many of them had secrets buried in files like the ones he had just discussed. The realization hit him, then, a cold clarity that was more terrifying than any shouting match. This system wasn't broken. People like to say that. The system is broken. Washington is broken. No, it was working perfectly. It was designed to be this way. It was designed to fragment responsibility across time and agencies so that no single human being could ever be blamed. Patel didn't review the files? Well, the previous director did. The previous director didn't act? Well, the search warrant was limited. The search warrant was limited? Well, that was the Florida prosecutor's fault. The Florida prosecutor made a bad deal? Well, that was 20 years ago, and he's gone now. It was a shell game. The truth, was moved so fast between the cups of the FBI, the CIA, and the DOJ that by the time you lifted one up, it was gone. And the victims? Massie thought about the girls, the ones he had mentioned, the ones whose names were recklessly leaked by the DOJ in their rush to win a news cycle. They were the collateral damage of this shell game. They were told that the professionals were handling it. They were told to trust the process. But the process was a meat grinder. It took their trauma and turned it into paperwork. It took their screams and turned them into FD 302s, which were then filed away in a basement, marked incredible information, and left to rot. Massie stopped at a window, looking out over the Capitol grounds. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across them all. The question of the CIA haunted him the most. If there is such a file, and if it has not already been turned over, Patel's words replayed in his mind. The FBI, the top cops, were subservient. That was the only conclusion. If the CIA had a file on Epstein, and they did, and if they hadn't given it to the FBI, and they hadn't, then the FBI had no power to demand it. It meant that domestic law enforcement stopped at the water's edge of the intelligence community. It meant that there was a superstate above the deep state, a level of clearance where the laws of the United States were just suggestions. Epstein wasn't just a pervert. He was a node. He was a junction point where money, power, and intelligence met. He was an asset, and assets are protected even after they are dead, especially after they are dead. Massie pressed his forehead against the cool glass. He had exposed the Uni Party today. He had shown that when the chips were down, the Republicans and Democrats in the establishment would hold hands to protect the secrets. The Democrat from Maryland who had interrupted him with the 100,000 pages defense, he was part of it. He was playing goalie for the same team as the Bush-era prosecutors. It wasn't red versus blue. It was the insiders versus the outsiders. It was the blackmailed versus the free. And Thomas Massie, standing alone in the hallway, realized just how few free men were left in this building. Congressman, a young aide approached him, holding a phone. Sir, the clip is viral. 5 million views in 10 minutes. Elon just retweeted it. Massie looked at the phone. He saw himself on the small screen, holding up the 4 documents. He looked calm, almost academic, but he knew the fire that was burning inside him. Does it matter? Massie asked quietly. The aide looked confused. Sir, we're trending. We're winning the narrative. We're winning the internet. Massie corrected him. But are we winning the justice? The aide fell silent. He didn't have an answer for that. In Washington, winning the internet was usually the goal. It was the currency of the realm. But Massie wasn't interested in currency. He was interested in the structural integrity of the bridge they were all standing on. And he knew the bridge was rotten. Let's go, Massie said, pushing away from the window. Where to, sir? You have a fundraiser at the Capitol Hill Club. No, Massie said. I'm going home. I need to check the perimeter. It was a joke, mostly. Massie's off-the-grid home in Kentucky was famous for its self-sufficiency. But there was a truth to it. He needed to get away from the fog. He needed to be somewhere where the laws of physics still applied, where if you dropped a stone, it fell instead of floating away in a cloud of interagency spin. As he walked towards the exit, the words of the hearing echoed one last time in his mind. The FBI will look at any new investigative leads. It was the polite way of saying, stop looking, Congressman. You won't like what you find. But Massie wouldn't stop. That was the difference. That was why they feared him. They feared him because he didn't want their cocktail parties. He didn't want their board seats. He didn't want their approval. He wanted the list. He wanted the 20 names. He wanted the prince. He wanted the billionaire. He wanted the magician. Because until those names were read into the record, not as descriptions but as indictments, the Republic was a lie. Until the law applied equally to the man sleeping under a bridge and the man sleeping in a palace, there was no law. There was only power. Massie pushed open the heavy brass doors of the Rayburn building. The cool evening air of D.C. hit him. It smelled of exhaust and cherry blossoms, the perfume of a city that was beautiful on the outside and poisonous on the inside. He walked down the steps, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the illuminated dome. The hearing was over. The cameras were off. The files were back in the dark. But the seed had been planted. Millions of people had seen the stutter. Millions of people had heard the silence. Millions of people now knew that the emperor wasn't just naked. He was complicit. Massie checked his watch. The night was young, and the real fight, was just beginning. He hailed a cab, refusing the government car. "Where to, buddy?" the driver asked. "Somewhere real," Massie muttered. "Just drive." As the car pulled away, fading into the traffic of the Beltway, the Capitol dome glowed behind him, a magnificent, white sepulchre full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness, waiting for the day when the stone would finally be rolled away.